Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we will delve into a narrative that has spanned generations, carrying with it secrets so dark they continue to send shivers down the spines of those brave enough to investigate. Please comment below to tell us where you are watching from and if you have heard of the sinister events that shook Virginia in the late 1860s. The year is 1868. The Civil War had concluded just 3 years prior, leaving profound scars across the American South. Virginia, in particular, was still nursing wounds that extended far beyond the battlefields. Families had been torn apart, fortunes had vanished like morning mist, and a palpable atmosphere of distrust lingered over communities that had once lived in relative harmony. This was an era where silence was more valuable than gold, and secrets were guarded with the same fierceness as life itself. In the heart of Albemarle County, roughly 15 miles from Charlottesville, stood an estate that evoked both admiration and an inexplicable unease in those who traveled near its lands. The Crowhurst Mansion, constructed decades before the war, stood as a monument to the South's aristocratic past. Its white columns reflected the afternoon sun, yet there was something about the perpetually closed windows, even on the hottest Virginia summer days, that made nearby neighbors avert their gaze as they passed the dusty road leading to the property. The Crowhurst family had settled in Virginia early in the 19th century, bringing with them not only considerable wealth, but also a reputation for discretion that bordered on mystery. For decades, they remained respected, yet distant figures in local society. They participated only in essential community functions, attended the local Baptist church with military regularity, but seldom opened their home for social calls. This behavior, while odd, was not entirely unusual among affluent families who had suffered significant losses in the war and preferred to keep their financial struggles hidden from prying neighbors. In the autumn of 1868, the family consisted of 7 members living under the same stately roof. At the head was Cornelius Crowhurst, a 62-year-old man whose rigid posture and piercing gaze intimidated even the boldest Charlottesville merchants. Beside him was his wife, Eleanor, 10 years his junior, who presented a disconcerting contrast. Where he was hard as stone, she appeared fragile as porcelain, with a smile that never reached her dark, sunken eyes. The couple had 4 adult children who remained on the estate, even after reaching an age to start their own lives. Thomas, the eldest son at 34, worked with his father managing the land. 31-year-old Margaret had never married and devoted her days to caring for the house and her mother. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, both 28, were rarely seen beyond the property's boundaries, fueling whispered speculation in local shops and taverns. Completing the household was Aunt Constance, Eleanor's elder sister, a 65-year-old woman who had arrived at the mansion years earlier under circumstances never fully explained. It was said she suffered a nervous breakdown after her husband's death in the war, and the Crowhursts had taken her in out of Christian charity. Constance lived in seclusion in her second-floor rooms, and the few who claimed to have seen her through the windows described a spectral figure, always dressed in black, staring intently for hours at the woods surrounding the property. The Crowhurst land spanned approximately 200 acres of partially cultivated fields, neglected orchards, and dense forests that had grown wild during the war. A small family cemetery was hidden among ancient oaks about 300 meters from the main house. Here, generations of Crowhursts had been buried in private ceremonies that excluded even the closest neighbors. Reverend Josiah Matthews from the Charlottesville Baptist Church was typically the only outsider present, and even he later commented in private on the oppressive atmosphere he felt during those hurried services. On an October morning, as the leaves began turning gold and crimson, the first public sign that something was terribly wrong at the Crowhurst Mansion emerged. Samuel Whitmore, the postman in his 40s, who had served the route for nearly 2 decades, noticed something unusual. For 3 consecutive weeks, mail for the family had piled up in the wooden box at the entrance. This alone might not have been alarming, save for 2 disturbing details. First, among the letters were official documents from the Charlottesville Bank, the kind of correspondence indebted families would never ignore. Second, and more unsettling, Whitmore swore he saw smoke rising from the mansion's chimneys during his morning deliveries, indicating someone was definitely home. The postman's concern grew with each visit. Through years on his route, he had developed a discreet familiarity with the family's habits. He knew, for instance, that Thomas Crowhurst usually checked the mailbox every Monday morning, and that Margaret would occasionally wave from the balcony. But during those 3 weeks in October, there was nothing, only a dense silence that seemed to emanate from the mansion like an invisible mist, swallowing any sound that dared approach its white walls. On the 23rd, troubled by his growing unease, Whitmore broke protocol. Instead of just depositing the mail, he walked down the oak-lined drive to the main entrance. His footsteps on the gravel echoed loudly on the cold morning, and he felt a shiver unrelated to the temperature. The first-floor curtains were drawn on every window, something he had never seen before, even on the hottest summer days. Whitmore knocked on the heavy oak door once, twice, 3 times. The sound reverberated through the structure, but no one answered. He waited for minutes that felt like hours. Just as he was about to leave, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Slow, hesitant footsteps descending a staircase, as if the person was injured or carrying an immense weight. The door opened a crack, about 10 centimeters, revealing half of Margaret Crowhurst's face. It took the postman a moment to recognize her. The woman he knew, always impeccably dressed with neat hair, was now unrecognizable. Her face was as pale as candle wax, her eyes sunken and shadowed by dark circles, suggesting sleepless nights. Her hair, once in an elegant bun, fell untidily over her shoulders. But most disturbing was her expression, a mixture of fear and something else Whitmore would later describe as utter resignation. Margaret said nothing at first, just stared with empty eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, as if unused for days. She stated the family was fine, busy with internal matters, and thanked him for his concern. Before Whitmore could ask questions or offer help, she reached out a trembling hand, took the mail, and closed the door. The sound of the lock turning echoed with a finality that made the postman step back instinctively. Deeply disturbed, Whitmore went straight to Sheriff Benjamin Tucker's office in Charlottesville after finishing his route. Tucker, 53, was an experienced man who had served in the war and become sheriff 2 years after its end. He had seen much, but Whitmore's description of Margaret and the mansion's atmosphere awakened a police instinct he trusted. Sheriff Tucker knew the Crowhursts only superficially. They had never caused trouble or been the subject of complaints. They were the kind of family officials preferred, discreet, scandal-free, and until recently, timely taxpayers. But Tucker also knew that the most respectable families could hide the darkest secrets behind polished facades. The war had taught him that appearances could be more deceptive than the testimony of a drunk. For 2 days, Tucker weighed the situation. Legally, he had no grounds to visit the estate. No formal complaint, no reported crime, no request for help. Showing up without cause could generate complaints and political complications he wished to avoid. Albemarle County was still recovering economically, and tensions between social factions remained high. Harassing a landowning family could cost him his job. Yet, Whitmore's account of Margaret Crowhurst haunted him. It echoed past cases he preferred to forget. During the war and its chaotic aftermath, Tucker had investigated isolated families and learned that prolonged silence was rarely a sign of peace. Often, it preceded discoveries that would haunt everyone involved for years. On the afternoon of October 26th, Tucker made a decision. He rode to the Crowhurst estate with his most trusted deputy, Daniel Porter, a capable 26-year-old. Tucker told Porter this was merely a courtesy call, a show of community concern any good sheriff would make. The ride from Charlottesville took just over an hour. The day was gray, with low clouds threatening rain. As they neared the mansion, both men sensed a change. The birds were absent. The wind carried a strange odor, not quite rot, but something that turned the stomach. At the property entrance, Tucker saw the fields were abandoned. Crops that should have been harvested weeks ago rotted on the stalks. Tools lay scattered as if dropped abruptly. A barn door slammed in the wind, its metallic clang echoing disturbingly. They tied their horses to a post by the main porch. The animals were unusually restless, neighing softly and pulling at their reins as if desperate to leave. Porter had to calm his mount for a full minute before securing it, muttering reassurances that had little effect. Tucker climbed the 5 porch steps with deliberately heavy footfalls, ensuring his presence was announced. He knocked 3 times, firmly but not aggressively. The sound echoed inside, and this time, there was no long wait. In under 30 seconds, the door opened fully, revealing Thomas Crowhurst. He was dressed formally, as if expecting important guests, but his clothes had a subtle sloppiness that caught the sheriff's eye. His white shirt had a small stain on the left cuff, resembling old coffee or diluted blood. His tie was slightly crooked, and shadows under his eyes mirrored the lack of sleep seen in his sister Margaret. Thomas greeted the officers with cold, mechanical courtesy, asking how he could help while positioning his body to block the view inside. Tucker explained they had heard about the piled-up mail and, as the sheriff responsible for all county citizens' welfare, thought a check-in was prudent. Thomas stood motionless for long seconds, his face an unreadable mask. Then, with a sharp movement that made Porter instinctively reach for his gun, he stepped aside and silently gestured for them to enter. The interior was what one would expect from a wealthy family. Dark, heavy wood furniture, expensive Persian rugs, ancestor portraits on damask-walled walls. Yet, something was deeply wrong. A fine layer of dust-covered surfaces that should have been polished daily. Heavy curtains blocked most natural light, creating a gloom that required lamps in the afternoon. The odor from outside was stronger inside, mixed with vinegar, likely used to mask the original smell. Thomas led them to a formal living room and invited them to sit on dark green velvet couches. He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture meant to convey authority, but which only revealed the tension in his rigid shoulders. Tucker chose a non-confrontational method, casually inquiring about how the family was managing after the harvest season, mentioning he had observed the fields were not fully cultivated. Thomas's reply came after another awkward silence. He clarified that his father, Cornelius, had become gravely ill approximately a month prior. The sickness had confined him to his bed, demanding the entire family focus their efforts on his care, which led to a temporary neglect of farm work. It was an entirely plausible explanation, the sort of circumstance that frequently happened on rural estates, where help was limited. However, Thomas's delivery monotone and with infrequent blinking made each word seem rehearsed, memorized, and mentally repeated dozens of times before being spoken. Tucker offered his sympathies regarding Cornelius's condition and asked if any physicians had been summoned to examine the patriarch. Thomas affirmed that Dr. Harold Morrison from Charlottesville had visited the estate twice in the preceding weeks. This detail caused Tucker to frown slightly. He had known Morrison for years, and the doctor had never mentioned treating Cornelius Crowhurst, despite a casual conversation at the barber shop just 3 days earlier. It was possible Morrison simply maintained patient confidentiality, but it still struck him as odd. It was then that Tucker heard a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A noise emanated from the upper floor, muffled by the thick walls and wooden floors, yet still perceptible in the room's heavy silence. It was a low, drawn-out moan that didn't sound entirely human, yet wasn't clearly animal either. It lasted mere seconds before cutting off abruptly, as if stifled or forcibly suppressed. Thomas showed no reaction to the sound. He didn't glance upward, offer an explanation, or display surprise or concern. His expression remained fixed, as if that spectral moan were as commonplace as the ticking of a clock. But Porter, younger and less practiced at controlling his reactions, turned his head sharply toward the ceiling, his hand again moving unconsciously nearer to his weapon. Noticing the escalating tension, Tucker decided to be more direct. He asked if it might be possible to speak briefly with other family members, simply to confirm everyone was all right. The request was met with the expected resistance. Thomas explained his mother, Eleanor, was in the chambers with her ailing father and could not be disturbed. Margaret was resting after having spent the previous night caring for Cornelius. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, were attending to chores at the rear of the property. As for Aunt Constance, she rarely descended from her quarters due to her delicate nervous condition. Each excuse was reasonable on its own, but collectively, they formed a pattern Tucker's police experience recognized: complete isolation. No one was available to verify or challenge the official story, no one accessible to answer uncomfortable questions, no independent witness to the family's true situation. Sheriff Tucker knew he was on precarious ground. Without a formal complaint or concrete evidence of a crime, forcing his way into the upper levels of Crowhurst Manor could lead to legal and political repercussions he wasn't prepared to face. Yet his instincts, sharpened by years of police work and the brutal experiences of war, screamed that something was terribly wrong inside that house. The moan they had heard echoed in his mind like a funeral bell, impossible to disregard. He opted for a different tactic. Adopting a casual, almost friendly tone, Tucker mentioned he would like to personally convey his wishes for a swift recovery to Cornelius, as they had met a few times at community events over the years. It was a partial untruth. He and Cornelius had exchanged at most a handful of words on those occasions, but it served to create a social pretext for insisting on seeing him. Thomas visibly hesitated for the first time. His jaw twitched, his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and his hands, still clasped behind his back, clenched tightly enough for his knuckles to whiten. For a brief moment, Tucker thought he would outright refuse the request. But then, as if reaching an internal conclusion after quick deliberation, Thomas nodded slowly. He led them up the main staircase, an imposing dark wood structure with an ornately carved banister. The steps creaked under their feet, each sound echoing through the silent house in an almost accusatory manner. The walls along the staircase were adorned with family portraits dating back decades. Tucker noted that in every single one, without exception, the faces of the Crowhursts bore the same somber, distant expression, as if happiness were a concept foreign to that lineage. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, doors closed on either side. Light here was even scarcer, with only a narrow window at the corridor's end, admitting a pale beam of gray light. Thomas guided them to the right, stopping before the third door. Before opening it, he turned to the officers and, in a near whisper, asked them to keep the visit brief, as his father required rest. Cornelius Crowhurst's room was spacious, yet suffocating. Heavy curtains completely blocked the windows, and the air was thick with a mixture of medicinal smells, sweat, and something else Tucker couldn't quite identify. Candles burned in various holders around the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A four-poster bed dominated the center, and upon it, buried under layers of blankets despite the room's noticeable warmth, lay a figure Tucker assumed was Cornelius. Eleanor Crowhurst sat in a chair beside the bed, her hands resting symmetrically in her lap. She did not rise when the men entered, showing no surprise or curiosity at the sheriff and his deputy's presence. She simply looked at them with the same vacant expression the postman had described in Margaret, as if looking through them rather than at them. Tucker approached the bed, his eyes adjusting to the dim light to examine the sick man. Cornelius lay on his back, utterly motionless. His face was pale, his lips slightly bluish, his eyes closed. His breathing, if it existed, was so shallow Tucker had to watch for several seconds before detecting the faintest movement of his chest. The man's hands rested on the blanket, and Tucker noticed something disturbing. His fingernails were dirty, as if he had been digging in soil, and there were scratches on the backs of his hands, some recent enough to still appear reddish. Tucker asked Eleanor about the specific nature of her husband's illness. She was slow to respond, and when she finally did, her voice was distant, almost as if reciting something she had been instructed to say. She spoke of a sudden fever, accompanied by extreme weakness and episodes of disorientation. Dr. Morrison had diagnosed it as an infection that sometimes afflicted the elderly, prescribing bed rest and medications she faithfully administered every 4 hours. It was a plausible medical explanation, but something in Eleanor's delivery made Tucker suspicious. He asked to see the prescribed medications. Eleanor gestured to a side table where several dark glass bottles were lined up. Tucker picked one up, removed the cork, and sniffed its contents. It was laudanum, an opium tincture commonly used for pain and as a sedative. The other bottles contained similar substances, preparations based on opium, belladonna, and other potent sedatives. Collectively, these medications were more than sufficient to keep someone in a state of perpetual semi-consciousness. While Tucker examined the medicines, Porter remained near the door, observing the scene with growing unease. It was he who noticed something the sheriff, focused on Cornelius, had missed. In the room's far corner, partially obscured by shadows, stood a second, smaller bed, and in it, covered up to the neck with a gray blanket, was another figure. Porter discreetly touched Tucker's arm and gestured with a slight nod. Tucker turned and, for the first time, noticed the room's second occupant. He walked over, ignoring a faint sound of protest from Eleanor. The figure on the smaller bed was an elderly woman, her hair completely white and splayed across the pillow. Her eyes were open, but entirely devoid of recognition or awareness. Her mouth was slightly agape, with a trickle of saliva tracing from the corner of her lips. Tucker recognized the signs. This person was so heavily sedated, she could barely process the world around her. He asked who the woman was. Thomas, who had remained by the door throughout the visit, replied that it was his Aunt Constance. She had suffered one of her severe nervous episodes a few weeks prior, becoming violent and requiring restraint for her own safety. Dr. Morrison had recommended sedation until she calmed down and could be transferred to a suitable institution in Richmond, the capital, for specialized care for her mental condition. Again, a perfectly acceptable explanation for the era. Institutions for the mentally ill were common, and families often kept distressed relatives sedated at home until arrangements could be finalized. But Tucker couldn't shake the feeling he was being presented with a series of carefully constructed half-truths, each sounding reasonable in isolation, yet together forming a narrative that didn't fully hold up. Tucker knew he needed to verify the story about Dr. Morrison, but to do so openly then would alert the family that his suspicions extended beyond a simple courtesy call. He decided to thank Thomas for his hospitality and informed him they would return in a few days to check on Cornelius's progress. Thomas's response was a silent nod, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's, as if trying to discern how much they truly suspected. They descended the stairs in silence. Reaching the main vestibule, Tucker made one final attempt to gather information. He casually asked if he could speak briefly with Margaret before departing, just to reassure her the postman's visit was no cause for concern. Thomas stated she was asleep, and that waking her would be cruel after the difficult night she'd had tending to her father. Then, as if to conclusively end the conversation, he walked to the door and opened it, the gray afternoon light flooding in and creating a stark contrast to the mansion's interior darkness. Tucker and Porter mounted their horses under Thomas's watchful gaze from the porch. He remained there until they disappeared down the oak-lined drive. Only when they were a sufficient distance from the property did the deputy finally speak, his voice filled with relief at being away from that place. He told the sheriff he had never felt anything like it, a sensation that every wall, every shadow, every corner of that house concealed secrets that could make brave men prey to their own ignorance. Tucker silently agreed. Throughout his career, he had developed an instinct for detecting when something was amiss, when presented stories were merely superficial layers, masking much darker truths. The Crowhurst Mansion radiated that kind of energy, a density in the air that transcended the physical and touched something more primal in human consciousness. The same ancestral alarm that warned our forebears of predators lurking in the darkness. Upon returning to Charlottesville, Tucker went directly to Dr. Harold Morrison's office, situated in a modest house on the town's main street. Morrison was a 58-year-old man who had practiced medicine in the county for over 3 decades. He possessed a solid reputation for competence and discretion, essential qualities for a doctor in a community where family secrets were guarded with religious fervor. The doctor was arranging his instruments when Tucker entered without knocking. Morrison's expression shifted from surprise to concern upon seeing the gravity on the sheriff's face. Tucker wasted no time on pleasantries. He asked directly when Morrison had last visited the Crowhurst family and what exactly Cornelius's condition was. The doctor's response made Tucker's blood run cold. Morrison had not visited the Crowhursts in nearly 2 months, not since a routine appointment in early September when he had examined Eleanor for a persistent but minor cough. Cornelius had been perfectly healthy then, walking the property and discussing plans for the autumn harvest. Morrison had received no calls to treat any sudden illness, had prescribed no sedative drugs for Cornelius or Constance, and had certainly not recommended admission to any institution. Tucker felt that familiar premonition that preceded cases he knew would haunt him. The Crowhurst family had deliberately lied about virtually everything. There was no doctor treating Cornelius. There was no official diagnosis. There was no professional supervision for the dangerous quantities of sedatives being administered to at least 2 people in that house. The question hammering in the sheriff's mind was, why? What was happening within those walls that necessitated keeping the family patriarch and his sister-in-law in a state of chemically induced unconsciousness? Morrison shared another disturbing piece of information. About 3 weeks earlier, the local pharmacist, Mr. Abernathy, had consulted him regarding an unusual purchase made by Thomas Crowhurst: significant quantities of laudanum, belladonna tincture, and other opiates. The pharmacist, concerned about the volume, had asked Morrison if he had prescribed such medications. Morrison had said no, but clarified there was nothing illegal about purchasing such substances, which were freely sold and commonly used in households to treat everything from toothaches to severe insomnia. Now, in light of the uncovered lies, that purchase took on a far more sinister significance. Tucker spent the remainder of that day and part of the night quietly interviewing individuals who had some form of contact with the Crowhurst family. The picture emerging from these conversations was of a family that had completely severed itself from the outside world over the past 6 weeks. The blacksmith who normally shoed the estate's horses had not been called since mid-September. The seamstress, who occasionally mended the family's clothes, had her last order abruptly canceled. Even Reverend Matthews from the Baptist Church, noted that the Crowhursts had missed Sunday services for 4 consecutive weeks, something unprecedented for this rigidly religious family. However, a conversation with a laundress named Abigail Chester provided the most disturbing detail. Abigail had worked for the Crowhursts for nearly 15 years, coming to the property every Monday to collect dirty laundry and returning it clean and pressed on Friday. She was a woman in her 40s, a war widow who depended on this work to support her 3 children. In mid-September, when she arrived at the mansion as usual, Margaret met her at the gate and informed her that her services were no longer required. There was no explanation, no notice, just a sudden dismissal accompanied by 2 weeks extra pay, as if that could compensate for 15 years of loyal service. What Abigail told Tucker, however, was about what had happened the week before her dismissal. She had noticed subtle yet disturbing changes in the family's behavior. Margaret, normally so cordial, had become tense and evasive. The clothes she washed began to show strange, persistent stains that required special treatment to remove. Furthermore, she would swear, though wasn't entirely certain, that she had heard screams coming from inside the mansion on one of those Monday mornings. Screams that were quickly silenced, but echoed just enough to reach her as she waited in the side yard. Tucker spent the night awake, sitting in his small room attached to the sheriff's office, surrounded by documents and notes about the Crowhurst family. He reviewed everything he knew, everything he had observed, every inconsistency and detected lie. The picture forming was of a family holding someone or something prisoner inside that mansion, using heavy sedatives to ensure their victims remained docile and silent. But this conclusion raised even darker questions. If Cornelius and Constance were being held against their will, who exactly was in control, and why? At dawn, Tucker made a decision. He needed greater legal authority to act, and for that, he required the approval of the municipal judge, the Honorable Silas Peaton. Peaton was a 71-year-old veteran of local politics from before the war, known as much for his legal wisdom as for his extreme caution in matters involving established county families. Convincing him to issue a search warrant based on suspicions and fragmented testimony would be challenging, but Tucker saw no other option. The meeting with Judge Peaton took place at his residence, an elegant Victorian home in downtown Charlottesville. The judge listened to Tucker's account with an increasingly grave expression, his fingers steepled under his chin in a thoughtful gesture. When Tucker finished, Peaton remained silent for long minutes, clearly weighing the legal and social implications of authorizing a formal trespass on a respected family's property based on circumstantial evidence. Finally, Peaton spoke. He stated that Tucker's suspicions were reasonable but not solid enough for a full search warrant. However, there was a legal alternative, a welfare check order. This order would allow the sheriff to return to the property with legal authority to personally examine all family members, ensuring no one was being held against their will or in unhealthy conditions. If during this check evidence of foul play was discovered, then a full search warrant could be issued immediately. Tucker accepted the proposal. Peaton drafted the verification order that same morning, signing it with his characteristic elaborate handwriting. It included a specific clause allowing Tucker to be accompanied by a licensed physician, and Morrison immediately volunteered for the role when informed. The doctor admitted to being deeply concerned about the unsupervised use of heavy sedatives Thomas Crowhurst had acquired, especially considering the lies about alleged medical advice. On the afternoon of October 28th, Tucker returned to the Crowhurst Mansion. This time, he was accompanied not only by Deputy Porter, but also by Dr. Morrison and 2 additional deputies summoned from neighboring areas, James Sullivan and Robert Hayes, both experienced and reliable men. Tucker didn't expect violence, but he wasn't willing to take unnecessary risks either. The group arrived at the property around 3 p.m. The sky had cleared since morning, and a pale autumn sun illuminated the landscape in a way that made the mansion less threatening than on the previous visit, but no less mysterious. Tucker immediately noticed the curtains were still drawn on all windows, a stark contrast to the relatively pleasant day outside. Thomas Crowhurst opened the door before Tucker could even knock, as if he had been waiting, watching the group's approach through a window. His expression was hard to interpret, a mixture of resignation and something resembling relief, as if a part of him knew this moment was inevitable, and perhaps even wanted it on some deep, unacknowledged level. Tucker presented the verification order, explaining in clear, professional terms that they were there to examine all family members and ensure they were in proper health and safety conditions. Thomas read the document slowly, his eyes scanning each line as if searching for a legal loophole to refuse. When he finished, he simply folded the paper, returned it to the sheriff, and stepped away from the door, making the same mute gesture of entry as before. The group entered, and Tucker immediately noticed the strange odor had intensified. It was no longer just vinegar and medicines. There was something else now, something organic and unpleasant that turned the stomach. Morrison also noticed, his professional expression momentarily replaced by a grimace of disgust before he regained his medical composure. Tucker instructed his deputies to remain downstairs, while he, Morrison, and Porter went upstairs with Thomas to examine Cornelius and Constance first. Thomas agreed without resistance, his attitude surprisingly cooperative now that legal authority had been established. They began climbing the stairs, the house's silence weighing on them like a physical presence. On the second-floor hallway, Tucker noticed something he had missed before. Several doors had locks on the outside. The locks looked recently installed, the wood around the bolts lighter than the rest of the aged door. They were locks designed not to prevent entry, but to prevent exit. Thomas led them back to the room where Cornelius and Constance lay. The scene was almost identical to the previous visit, except Eleanor was no longer in the chair beside her husband's bed. Thomas explained she was resting in another room, exhausted from nights of vigil. Tucker instructed Porter to locate and bring her, while he and Morrison examined the patients. Morrison approached Cornelius first, removing the heavy covers. What he revealed prompted a muffled exclamation of shock from the doctor. Cornelius's body was emaciated. His arms were like dry branches, his skin hanging loosely over his bones. Pressure sores marked his back and hips, injuries developing from prolonged immobility. His legs were atrophied, muscles visibly deteriorated from lack of use. Morrison checked Cornelius's vital signs. The pulse was weak but present, breathing shallow but regular. His eyes, when the doctor forced the eyelids open, were glazed and did not react to light. The pupils were constricted to tiny points, a classic sign of severe opioid intoxication. Morrison estimated, based on his experience, that Cornelius had been kept in a state of deep sedation for at least 4 to 5 weeks, perhaps longer. Morrison then moved to examine Constance. Her condition was equally alarming, though slightly different. She was also severely sedated, but her body showed signs of recent struggle. Yellowish bruises marked her wrists, the kind that appear from being tightly restrained. Her ankles had similar healing marks. When Morrison examined her mouth, he found small cuts on her tongue, suggesting she had bitten herself during seizures or extreme agitation, possibly when medication was forced down her throat. Tucker watched with an increasingly grim expression. He turned to Thomas, who had been standing near the door throughout the examination, and asked directly who had authorized the continuous administration of sedatives without medical supervision. Thomas did not immediately respond. His eyes wandered around the room, resting on everything except the sheriff's face, as if searching the shadows for an answer his mind couldn't formulate. At that moment, Porter returned with Eleanor Crowhurst. The woman looked as if she had aged 10 years since Tucker saw her 2 days prior. Her clothes were crumpled, her hair completely disheveled, and a stain resembling dried food marked her dress. But the most disturbing thing was her eyes, utterly empty of any spark of consciousness or self-will. She moved like an automaton, allowing Porter to guide her without resistance or question. Tucker asked Morrison to examine her as well. The doctor had Eleanor sit in a chair by the window and conducted a basic examination. Her pupils were also constricted, though not as much as Cornelius's. She answered simple questions with monosyllables, her voice monotonous and distant. When Morrison asked how long she had been taking laudanum, Eleanor said she didn't remember. When asked who gave her the medicines, she simply pointed at Thomas without looking at him. Tucker felt he was beginning to understand the dynamics of this house of horrors. Thomas, for some reason still unclear, had taken control of the family, keeping his parents and aunt in a state of deep sedation. But he couldn't have done it alone. Where were the other family members? Margaret had been seen by the postman, but under strange circumstances. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, had not appeared during any visits. Tucker needed to find them. He left Morrison to care for the 3 sedated patients and instructed Thomas to take him to Margaret. Thomas hesitated for the first time since the court order was presented. His hands began to shake slightly, and he looked down the hall as if considering flight. But Porter, noticing the change, moved strategically to block any potential escape route. Thomas finally agreed and led them down the corridor to another door, this one also with an external lock. He took a key from his vest pocket, his hands shaking so much it took 2 tries to insert it. When the door opened, an even stronger odor escaped, causing Tucker and Porter to instinctively recoil. The room was smaller than Cornelius's, with only a narrow window admitting minimal light. Margaret Crowhurst lay on a narrow bed, covered to her neck with a stained gray blanket. Unlike the others, her eyes were open, and there was awareness in them, but also a deep, paralyzing terror. Seeing Tucker, her lips moved, trying to form words, but only a hoarse, unintelligible sound emerged. Her throat was visibly inflamed, as if she had screamed until she lost her voice. Tucker approached carefully, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. He said he was there to help, that she was safe now. Margaret began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face into the pillow. She tried to speak again, and this time, Tucker understood fragments. Basement. Don't leave. Samuel and Sarah. Tucker's heart raced. The cellar. He had assumed the twins simply weren't in the house during the visits, that they might be in a remote part of the property. But Margaret's mention of the basement, combined with her obvious terror, painted a much more sinister picture. He turned abruptly to Thomas and demanded to know where the basement entrance was. Thomas retreated until his back was against the hallway wall. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh. It was not a laugh of joy or ordinary madness, but one of utter despair, the sound of a mind finally crumbling under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. Between intermittent laughter, Thomas began to speak, words tumbling out in a rambling torrent. He said they didn't understand, that no one would ever understand, that it had all started with the will, with the discovery that his father planned to leave everything to Samuel, the youngest son, completely ignoring Thomas, who had worked his whole life alongside him. That Margaret had found out and tried to intervene, but it was too late. That Constance knew too much and needed to be silenced. That Eleanor had become an accomplice, but then began to question, so she also had to be controlled. Tucker listened in horror to Thomas's fragmented confession, but a crucial part remained undisclosed. What exactly had happened to Samuel and Sarah? He repeated the question, this time with full police authority, ordering Thomas to take him to the basement immediately. Thomas's laughter ceased abruptly. He looked at Tucker with eyes that now seemed completely empty, as if something essential within him had been extinguished. Then, with robotic movements, he walked toward the staircase. But instead of descending to the ground floor, he continued up to a narrow door at the end of the third-floor hallway that Tucker hadn't previously noticed. He opened it, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. It wasn't the main basement, Tucker realized, but some kind of underground space accessible only from the third floor, probably an old cellar or storage space, converted for another purpose. Thomas lit a lamp from the wall and began to descend, with Tucker and Porter cautiously following. The descent seemed endless, wooden steps creaking, the air growing progressively cooler and damper. At the bottom, Tucker found himself in a low-vaulted space with stone walls dripping with moisture. Thomas's lamp cast grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. And then Tucker saw it. In the far corner of the basement, chained to the wall by iron shackles that looked repurposed from ancient agricultural use, were two figures, Samuel and Sarah Crowhurst. The scene that unfolded before Tucker's eyes would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Samuel and Sarah were sitting on the dirt floor, their backs against the damp stone wall. The chains binding them were long enough to allow limited movement within a roughly 2-meter radius, but not long enough to reach the staircase. Scattered around them were scraps of dried food, a tipped metal mug, and a bucket whose purpose Tucker preferred not to contemplate. The twins looked up as the lamplight reached them, and Tucker saw something that made him pause. Unlike their sedated parents and aunt, Samuel and Sarah were completely conscious. Their faces were dirty, hair matted, clothes torn and filthy, but their eyes shone with a mixture of desperate hope and deep fear. Seeing that Tucker was not alone, that there were witnesses besides Thomas, Samuel let out a sound between a sob and a cry of relief. Tucker immediately ordered the chains removed. Thomas, still dissociated, simply pointed to a key hanging from a nail on a wooden beam near the stairs. Porter quickly retrieved it, his hands working frantically to open the rusty padlocks, securing the shackles on the twins' wrists. The skin beneath the metal was raw, inflamed, and infected, evidence of weeks of confinement and desperate attempts to break free. As soon as they were released, Sarah collapsed into Porter's arms, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Samuel, though clearly weakened, managed to stand with Tucker's help. His voice emerged as he began to speak. The words tumbled out, stumbling over one another in their haste to finally voice the truth they had been forced to suppress. The story Samuel recounted was even darker than Tucker had imagined. It had all begun in mid-September, when their father, Cornelius, announced at a family dinner that he had revised his will. The property and all assets would now be divided equally among all the children, a significant change from the previous will, which left the majority to Thomas as the firstborn. Cornelius explained that this was the fair decision, acknowledging that everyone had contributed equally to keeping the family together through the difficult years of war and Reconstruction. Thomas received the news in silence, but Samuel noticed something in his eyes at that moment, a darkness he had never before seen in his older brother. That very night, Thomas sought out Samuel and Sarah separately, attempting to convince them to support a plan to make their father reconsider. When both refused, stating that Cornelius's decision was just, Thomas retreated to his chambers without another word. 2 days later, Cornelius suddenly fell ill after breakfast. He experienced dizziness and extreme weakness, barely able to climb the stairs to his room. Thomas insisted on personally caring for him, keeping everyone else away under the pretext that his father required absolute rest. Eleanor, always obedient to her firstborn son, accepted this without question. Margaret expressed concern, but Thomas convinced her everything was under control, claiming he had consulted Dr. Morrison and was following precise medical instructions. Samuel and Sarah, however, grew suspicious when they realized they were never allowed to see their father alone. Thomas was always present during any brief visits. When they confronted their older brother directly, accusing him of intentionally keeping their father sedated, Thomas vehemently denied it. But the twins decided to investigate on their own. It was Sarah who discovered the bottles of laudanum and other sedatives hidden in Thomas's room quantities no responsible doctor would prescribe for any condition. When she confronted Margaret with this discovery, hoping to find an ally, she was shocked to learn her sister already knew. Margaret tearfully admitted that Thomas had threatened her, saying that if she told anyone about the sedatives, he would ensure she too ended up locked away and declared insane, just like Aunt Constance. The twins discovered that Constance had not suffered any genuine nervous breakdown. She had simply witnessed Thomas administering excessive doses of laudanum to his father and had tried to intervene. As a result, she became another prisoner in Thomas's obsessive quest to maintain control over the family, and consequently, over the inheritance he believed was rightfully his. Samuel and Sarah knew they needed to act, but before they could seek outside help, Thomas anticipated their moves. One evening, as they went downstairs for dinner, they found Thomas waiting with two men occasionally hired for heavy work on the estate during harvest. The men, paid handsomely, and convinced the twins had gone mad and posed a danger to the family, helped Thomas subdue Samuel and Sarah and drag them into that forgotten basement. In the weeks that followed, Thomas visited daily, bringing just enough food and water to keep them alive. He said he needed time to think, to find a solution that did not involve direct violence. He talked to himself during these visits, rationalizing his actions, convincing himself he was protecting the family legacy, that his father was old and confused, and that the decision to divide the inheritance was the result of senility, not justice. Margaret, unable to bear the guilt of her complicity through silence, began to show signs of an emotional breakdown. She cried uncontrollably, refused to eat, and threatened to scream for help from the window. Thomas responded by locking her in her own room, administering mild sedatives to keep her calm, but conscious enough to continue helping with basic household chores when needed. Eleanor, in turn, became a shadow of her former self. Initially Thomas's willing accomplice, sharing his view that the firstborn deserved to inherit everything, she gradually realized the monstrosity of what they had initiated, but by then it was too late to back down. Thomas began sedating her as well, not as intensely as his father, but enough to maintain her docility and ensure her silence. As Samuel related this narrative of domestic horror, Tucker watched Thomas. The man remained seated on the lowest step of the stairs throughout his brother's confession, head bowed, hands hanging between his knees. He did not deny, protest, or offer justifications. It was as if finally hearing the full story from a voice other than his own had shattered the last barrier of denial that had precariously sustained his sanity. Tucker ordered Porter to immediately take Samuel and Sarah out of that cursed basement and transport them to Dr. Morrison's house for urgent medical treatment. The twins had to be practically carried up the stairs, their legs too weak after weeks of confinement to support their own weight. As they ascended, Sarah looked back one last time, her eyes meeting Thomas's. There was no hatred in that look, only a deep, incomprehensible sadness, the kind that comes from seeing someone you loved transform into something unrecognizable. Tucker remained in the basement with Thomas for a few minutes after the others left. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the weight of all the horrific revelations that had emerged from that damp, gloomy space. Finally, Tucker asked the question that still plagued him. What did Thomas ultimately intend to do? Hold everyone prisoner indefinitely, expecting his father to die of seemingly natural causes from prolonged sedation? Thomas slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting Tucker's for the first time since they had descended into the basement. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly calm, almost serene, as if discussing something trivial rather than conspiracy to murder and the illegal imprisonment of his own family members. He said he didn't know, that every day he woke up hoping to have either the courage to finish what he had started or the wisdom to undo everything. That the plan, if there ever was one, had collapsed within the first 48 hours, but the fear of consequences made it impossible to retreat. He admitted he had kept them all sedated or imprisoned because he could not face the reality of what he had done. Each dose of laudanum administered to his father was another layer of self-deception, another lie to himself that he was merely buying time. Each meal brought to the twins in the basement was accompanied by silent promises that tomorrow would be different. That tomorrow he would find the courage to free them and face the consequences. But the tomorrows kept coming, and the courage never arrived. Tucker listened to it all with an impassive expression. He had seen many crimes throughout his career, from petty robberies to brutal murders motivated by passion or greed. But there was something particularly disturbing about this case, in the way familial love and ambition had intertwined into a downward spiral of control and cruelty. Thomas was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was a man who had allowed a poisonous idea of entitlement and inheritance to corrupt everything that should have been sacred. They ascended from the basement in silence. On the ground floor, Tucker instructed his other two deputies, Sullivan and Hayes, to formally arrest Thomas Crowhurst on charges of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, attempted murder, and several other crimes prosecutors were sure to add later. Thomas offered no resistance as the iron handcuffs closed around his wrists. He simply followed the deputies to the carriage that would take them to the Charlottesville jail, his steps as slow as those of a man walking to the scaffold. Tucker remained at the mansion with Morrison, who had come from the first floor after ensuring Eleanor was stable enough to be left briefly. Together, they began the process of assessing the full extent of what had occurred in that house. Morrison examined Cornelius again, this time with greater care and time. The medical evaluation was severe. Cornelius had lost approximately 15 pounds. His muscles were atrophied, and there were signs of severe malnutrition in addition to the effects of prolonged sedation. Recovery would be possible, but it would take months and require constant medical care. Constance was in a similar condition, though slightly less severe due to a somewhat shorter period of sedation. She had developed pressure sores that were beginning to infect, and her response to external stimuli was almost non-existent. Morrison expressed concern that even with proper treatment, she might never fully regain her mental faculties. Eleanor was the most difficult case to assess. Physically, she was in better condition than the others, but psychologically, she appeared to have suffered profound damage. When Morrison attempted to speak with her, inquiring about her involvement in the events, she merely repeated fragmented phrases about maternal duty, about supporting the firstborn, about keeping the family together. She did not demonstrate a full understanding of the gravity of what had transpired, or perhaps her mind simply refused to accept this reality. Margaret was brought from the upper floor and seated in the living room while Morrison cleaned and treated her sore throat. Between painful sips of water, she confirmed Samuel's version of events, adding details only someone living inside that domestic prison could know. She spoke of how she had tried to reason with Thomas, how she had begged him to seek help before it was too late. She described the nights when she heard Samuel and Sarah's muffled screams emanating from the basement, knowing precisely what they signified, but being physically and psychologically incapable of helping them. The guilt she carried was almost tangible, manifesting in every broken word she uttered. Tucker tried to reassure her stating that she too was a victim, that the fear Thomas had instilled in her was real and justifiable. But Margaret shook her head repeatedly, insisting she should have been stronger, braver, that her silence had made her an accomplice to horrors she would never forgive herself for allowing. As the sun began to set that October afternoon, Tucker arranged for Cornelius and Constance to be transported to Morrison's home for proper medical care. Eleanor was taken to stay with a neighboring family Tucker knew and trusted, people who could look after her while her level of responsibility was determined. Margaret insisted on staying in the mansion for the night, stating she wouldn't be able to sleep anywhere else and that she preferred a familiar space, even one now stained with memories that would haunt her forever. Tucker left Deputy Hayes with Margaret to ensure her safety and to serve as a witness, preventing the destruction of evidence prosecutors would need for the case against Thomas. Before departing, Tucker walked one last time through the mansion's halls, observing how a place meant to represent prosperity and family legacy had become a monument to greed and obsessive control. In the basement where Samuel and Sarah had been held, Tucker found something the twins hadn't mentioned initially: scratches on the stone walls, marks likely made with sharp stones or metal fragments found in the dark. They were not random. They were tallies, 28 vertical marks, each representing a day of captivity. Beside the marks, words were scraped into the stone with obvious effort. God forgive us. God forgive him. God save us. The days following the discovery of the horrors at Crowhurst Manor shook Albemarle County profoundly, an impact few events had managed even during the turbulent war years. Word spread rapidly, first in shocked whispers through Charlottesville's shops and taverns, then in detailed local newspaper articles that were picked up by publications in Richmond and beyond. The case became known as the Sinister Silence of the Crowhursts, a title perfectly capturing the claustrophobic nature of the crimes committed within those respectable walls. The trial of Thomas Crowhurst began in December of that same year, 1868. The courthouse was packed daily with people from neighboring counties there to witness the proceedings. Thomas remained remarkably calm throughout, answering questions with bewildering honesty, never attempting to minimize or deny his actions. It was as if the discovery and imprisonment had finally unleashed something within him, allowing him to face the monstrosity of his deeds without the layers of self-deception that had sustained him during those terrible weeks. The prosecutor presented a devastating case. Samuel and Sarah testified, their voices weak but firm, describing every detail of their confinement. Margaret, pale and trembling, recounted her own imprisonment and the psychological terror she had endured. Dr. Morrison provided medical testimony on the condition of Cornelius and Constance, explaining to the jury how close both had been to death when they finally received proper treatment. Eleanor was not called to testify. Her mental state had deteriorated significantly in the weeks after the events, and doctors determined her unfit for legal proceedings. The question of her complicity versus victimization remained a gray area, debated in legal and social circles for years, but never resolved in court. Thomas's defense was brief and largely symbolic. His lawyer argued that the pressure of maintaining the family property after the war, combined with the shock of seeing his birthright discarded so casually, had induced a temporary mental breakdown. Yet, as these arguments were presented, Thomas sat blankly, seemingly disconnected from his own defense, as if he had already internally accepted the inevitable verdict. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Peaton pronounced the sentence in a grave, solemn voice. 25 years in the state penitentiary in Richmond, without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. It was one of the harshest sentences in the county for decades, reflecting not only the crime's gravity, but also the profound moral shock the case had caused the community. Thomas was transferred to Richmond in January 1869. Occasional reports reaching Charlottesville over the following years depicted a man who had retreated completely into himself, working quietly in prison workshops, rarely speaking to other prisoners or guards, existing in a state of quiet penance. As for the other family members, their fates varied. It took Cornelius nearly 6 months to regain enough physical strength to walk unaided. Mentally, he remained affected by the experience. Though he regained basic lucidity, he often confused past and present, calling for Thomas in moments of disorientation, and then weeping upon remembering his firstborn's absence. He lived only 3 more years, dying in 1871 from a fever his weakened body could not fight. Constance never fully recovered. She was transferred to a Richmond institution, where she spent her final years in a semi-conscious state, rarely recognizing visitors, living in an inner world perhaps kinder than her memories. She died in 1873 and was buried in the institution's cemetery, not in the Crowhurst family plot associated with dark secrets. Eleanor remained mentally frail for the rest of her life. She lived with a Charlottesville family who treated her kindly, spending her days in contemplative silence, rarely mentioning the events that destroyed her family. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1877, a peace some said was the first genuine peace she had known in nearly a decade. Margaret carried her guilt like a cross until her final days. She never married, never left Albemarle County, devoting her life to charitable works, particularly aiding women in difficult domestic situations, as if atoning for her silence by helping others find a voice. She died in 1892 at age 55, leaving her entire inheritance to women's shelters in Charlottesville and Richmond. Samuel and Sarah recovered physically from their ordeal, though the scars on their wrists remained permanent reminders of their weeks in the basement. They sold the Crowhurst estate in 1870, unable to imagine living there again, and moved west to Kentucky, where no one knew their surname or its dark history. They married, had children, and lived deliberately ordinary, quiet lives, as if balancing the horror of their youth with the peace of their maturity. The Crowhurst Mansion stood empty for several years after the sale, as no buyer would live in a place so tainted by tragedy. It was eventually acquired by a land speculator who demolished it completely in 1876, selling the materials and leaving the land empty. Workers involved in the demolition reportedly spoke of strange sensations, sudden chills on hot days, and unexplained sounds, though such stories were likely products of imagination fueled by the place's reputation. Sheriff Tucker never forgot the Crowhurst case. He remained in office for another 15 years, retiring in 1883. In interviews and conversations, he always cited it as the most impactful of his career, not for the physical violence, which was relatively limited, but for how it revealed how respectable families could hide chasms of moral darkness behind polished facades. It taught him that silence is not always dignity, that privacy can mask horror, and that sometimes the thickest walls are built not to protect those inside, but to imprison them. Today, over a century and a half later, the site where the Crowhurst Mansion once stood is merely an open field in Albemarle County, with no marker or memorial. Most local residents are unaware of the story, and those who know it rarely speak of it. But if you visit on a fall afternoon, when the leaves turn golden and the air carries a Virginia chill, you might sense something in the wind, a whisper of all the secrets those walls kept, of all the voices silenced, of all the screams that went unheard until it was almost too late. The story of the Crowhurst family stands as a grim reminder of how greed can corrupt familial love, how the desire for control can become tyranny, and how silences born of fear can become prisons as real as iron chains. It is a story about the limits of forgiveness, the weight of complicity, and the price paid when ambition eclipses basic humanity. And perhaps most importantly, it is a story about the courage to break silences, about the importance of voices that refuse to be silenced, about people like the postman who recognized something was wrong and trusted his instincts, about the sheriff who relied on his experience without initial concrete evidence, and about the twins who survived by clinging to hope, even in the literal and figurative depths of darkness. If this journey through one of the most disturbing chapters in American history has touched you in any way, consider subscribing to this channel. We bring forgotten stories, mysteries time has tried to bury, dark truths that still echo through the decades. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this story of the Crowhursts, and if you know of other cases where family silence hid terrible secrets. Until the next story.